that they needed to, and that probably is a reflection again of fear of being identified and associated with a position and therefore targeted, not in a positive way, in a negative way. So I really am, and let me pause and get a reaction from y'all, because there's some other things I would want to say, because it is not only in, as I would say, in the political arena. So in essence, what I really wanted to look at is what are the consequences of this prevailing climate of fear at different levels of the society. The question is, why is this happening, and why such behaviors are intended? What is it that, or why do people seek to cause people to be fearful? And of course, some other point in time, because I'm not sure I have enough time to start to talk about that, what must we do to reverse that? And I saw Nigel put a very interesting there, and I made a note. He said that Barbadians are suffering from self-contempt and an existential psychosis. And my question is, why is that, and how does that relate to my whole concern about fear? Is it that we recognize certain realities about some people in terms of the notion of self-contempt, and we build on that? Or do we, so in other words, do we reinforce it by behaviors that instill fear, or because we are instilling fear, we are creating? Because I think the self-contempt is something which has to do with some of our history, and which is within the grasp of people to reverse. But and it may be about fear of change too, because I have only touched on a couple of things there, but I want to pause and hear what you think, Pastor Ferdinand, or what Glyne's thoughts are on the comments that I've made so far.
But Glyne, I know you're going to certainly have something to say here, but let me say this, Maxine. When we were in Washington, the evening of the commission, the hearing before the commission, myself and Timon attended another event. And in that event, there was a gentleman that was exceptionally informed on the entire matter of slavery, particularly Barbados. And I wish to God that we could have a conversation with him, but we didn't have the time. But he said something, and I found it very interesting, because I made the comment, in terms of a bit of our Barbadian heritage, that some of the best slaves are brought here. These are some of the things you were taught down through the years. They brought the nicest slaves here because, of course, the aristocracy of England and so on was here in Barbados. Barbados was the central hub of all the slaves going out everywhere else, that kind of thing. And he took me to task on it. And I was wondering, well, why is he taking me to task on this? I mean, and then he shared with me, he said, there are no docile Africans. He said there are no docile Africans in our ancestry. Africans are passionate, emotional, vibrant, active people. But then he spoke about how all of that was stifled and shut down by the colonial masters. And it is in that, when I started to hear him say that, I began to understand the root cause of what you are talking about, the root cause of the fear. Because of course you would know that back in those days, if you spoke up, you were lashed. If you didn't lose your life, you were beaten badly, you were hung on trees. All of these were the things that were done, as we would put it, to scare the hell out of the slaves so that they would be kept in line and that type of thing. So I'm just wondering if that has not been the core, so to speak, of an ancestral DNA that has come down through the years, so that we are afraid to say anything. I say, even when you have workers in a business, what you said is absolutely true. Everybody will come in, they're there to discuss the problems, nobody will say anything, and as soon as the manager, GM, or supervisors or whatever leave the room, then everybody starts to talk. So there's almost this inherent fear within us that if we open up our mouths and say anything, we're going to get into trouble and all this kind of thing. And he really shared with me, well, with us that were in the room at that time, how the colonial masters implemented that type of subjugation of the African slave, who would have been very different to what we're experiencing today. I don't know, Glyne, what you would have to share where that is concerned.
Yeah, I can speak half the night on this. Now,
Wow.
I'm very wary of people who make these bland, grandstand, wide, sweeping statements, psychoanalyzing Barbadians and Barbadian slaves. People give me the basis of their conclusion, on what are they basing these conclusions there? Are you just retroactive in projecting what we know of Barbados of the world there and go and judge the world at that time by the same standards? Because when I look at our delegation, Barbadians in Washington before the war, did you see any fear, any
No, sir.
servility,
We were
anything?
off the
So
plantation.
but we came from the same stock. I think it's an unless you can tell me how you arrived at this conclusion, that disputed we were there, even the youngest of us who did not would not have lived as long as you for a year, they were not fearful. I grew up in the Barbados where in Spooner when there were arguments and they getting rough and you want to shut down somebody, you know what they used to say? You can shut the park gate, I mean Queen's Park gate, which had to be shut at 9 o'clock at night, but you can't shut my mouth. And that I know has been the attitude of Barbados. And this thing, Barbadian slaves being docile and quiet. And, no, the Barbadian slave, if you do other research on slavery, because Barbados was a virtually flat country, had a lot of militia, etc. The slaves, we had no mountains and hills and valleys and forests around the house.
Yes,
They
that's
had
what he
to
said.
survive.
Nowhere to run.
Yeah.
To survive,
Nowhere to run.
they had to devise other tactics to survive in Barbados. That's why they would have passive resistance. Women would abort their children to refuse to give the slave master and that's a slave to rule. They would sabotage the slave master clothes and the food. So to believe that we had a band of yahoos in Barbados all down through the years who were afraid of themselves it does not make sense because some of it would have stayed more. How do you think Barbados got to be where it is by being docile?
No,
By agitated, by resisted. So you have to tell me how you come to those conclusions,
which
and
conclusion?
therefore, huh?
Which conclusion? I just want
I heard talk about
docility.
self contempt and psychosis. Well, I ain't got none of that. I know I got none of that.
Well, we
I
can
didn't
get
know.
Nigel to explain what he means. No,
Yeah,
I will
on
say
what
this though.
basis?
I will say this though, Glyne. I will tell you. I've been around almost as long as you have been. What I would say is that there's some Barbadians who this image of self is not what it should be. And to me I see elements of all of these things because when you talk about docility, I didn't buy that. Barbados was almost overpopulated from very early in its history, as Glyne suggested. As a flat island, we didn't have the rivers and the hills and the gullies and the whatever to disappear and for example, if you go to Suriname and you want to get to some of their maroon communities, you spend hours trying to cross the rivers and whatever to get
Yes.
to those points. So a person who left, you know, the enslaved situation, and I mean, I ran away, you got runaway bay in Jamaica. You have the Maroons in Jamaica because they had the physical space. No,
But in Barbados, you had militias galore. You had army and
precisely.
militia find it easily.
So you could
So
you couldn't get from St. Joseph to St. Michael as easy as without somebody picking up that you run away from whatever plantation or whatever. Now, what I wrote down here when we talked about DNA, for me, I think that I call it the presence of institutional and infrastructural DNA.
Hmm.
Because at
Hmm.
the end of the day, the
Hmm.
structures are which is I think what Glyne was referring to. Those were the things that were limiting. I mean, one of the solutions to the hard times in Barbados was people left here, and when you hear about Millie gone to Brazil, that song came up, and the person could have committed murder and say that she went to Brazil because there was migration to Brazil as there was to Panama. I mean, this is in more recent times. But at the end of the day, if I still look here, Dog Line, and this is because I talk, and this show, for example, as I said to somebody last night, I cannot go to the supermarket on any day of the week, and I can say this without somebody stopping me and saying something about what the show it has done or is doing for them in terms of information, etc. So I would not negate the I, you know, I as I said, Nigel will have to explain to me the whole thing of existential psychosis. What I buy into is that there are a lot of people whose image of self, and I will go back to find the word that he used, whose image of self is not what it should be. And it manifests itself in a number of things. For example, and when I said fear, I talk about fear. I use limited examples, but I also want to talk about what I have seen in engaging people in terms of fear of success and fear of failure. You know, for example, people will tell you, I remember when I decided that I wanted to leave the university and go into business, having taught entrepreneurship for more than a decade, introducing the course and so on. And I say to somebody, the thing that I'm telling people to do, I want to do. And people say to me, why would you leave the university where you get a good salary and whatever else? I mean, this was my mother too. And think about going into business with uncertainty. And I remember one of my colleagues at the university said, but you have a relatively new mortgage and whatever. And I say to the person, a mortgage is either a lot of money or a little bit of money, depending on how you look at it. And in everything, the house that I was born in is still occupied by my father. And therefore, but I think at the time when I left, no, my mother had already died. My mother had died when I left university, so it was still occupied by my father. So I'm thinking that I'm not labeling a whole society, but I'm saying that increasingly there's this pervading sense of I am very uncomfortable to the point of fearful to engage in certain kinds of things,
Yeah.
because
I'm not disputing the question of fear. I think the fear is very real. I've because of my age and watching politics and government in Barbados, I've seen governments come and go, change, etc. And gradually there's a question of fear of victimization, but it has never been this palpable. Never
that is
been this. Never. I know
But you know,
people in the civil service who are afraid even to write a letter to make a comment because and these are people who have, I'm not talking about the incumbent ones, but retired ones, even don't want retired ones who have a lot to offer Barbados, can give us great insights into what
and
is
they're
happening
fearful.
and they're fearful of that. So the fear is real, and you have to understand that Barbados is a very you're talking Martin talking about the fear of failing. Barbados is a very demanding society. Barbados, especially if you go abroad. In my time abroad, living and working, there are Barbadians who want to come back to Barbados, would love to migrate, but they did not meet the expectations in Barbados. Because when you leave Barbados, you're supposed to come either with money, a good education, or something. And they did not have that, so to come back. And Barbados have been fearful of risk because there have been generations of people who have lost money and hurt by Barbados and Barbadian institutions. So it's not in the DNA. It's part of the folklore. Even today, here people talk about. You ever heard of Mackie Simmons Penny Bank, Mackie?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, and that's long
Yes,
ago.
sir.
Freddie, you must have heard it. So this thing is real. And let me talk about self-image. Maybe I see myself first of all. I've always seen myself first of all as a person. Secondly, I'm a Barbadian, because Barbadian made me what I am. And thirdly, I'm a black man. That is how I see myself. But it is Barbados that has
Second,
socialized
first,
me. So
Barbados.
first one. So I am not, I'm sorry, I am not an African. I have African connections. In the same way, I'm not English because I have English connections and socialization. I have connections. All of that is part of my history and my culture. I recognize them. I don't feel good or short, bad. It is reality. So therefore, I am not quick to condemn Barbadian or return Barbadians anyway, because you have to live people's reality. and you have to know about people and what might seem obvious to me that to do or not do, other people cannot because of their own peculiar circle. They might have been burned, their father burned, all kind of issues. So, and then last word I make, Barbados could not have made the progress they made since the 30s unless persons were daring, taking chances, breaking new ground. All our political leaders basically up to now have been positive, broke new ground. That is how we got here. We didn't get here by being African. We got here by being all out of our own collective wisdom and experience and know, figuring out the world, our old world view and our vision and our values or what we want Barbados to be. We can work to get Barbados sorted. So I don't think we can offshore it or subcontract to anybody. We have to do it for ourselves.
You know, there's a comment I'd like to share with you guys. You know, listening to what you're saying, especially with the group that went up. I'll say this, you know, Glyne, that um, I've grown up um, in business. I've grown up in a very religious sector as well, and I can tell you, Glyne, there's an element of fear even in the church. Where church members don't approach the priest or the pastor or the reverend, and I know the reasons for that. I've grown up in companies where I've heard people discussing matters to do with a particular problem in the company, and they are afraid to take it to the management of the company for fear of repercussions. And as you would know, Glyne, down through the years, Maxine, both of you would know, down through the years politically, there has been always this spectrum of victimization where if people see you associated, you take, for example, the marches that we have, you know, there are people who have told us point blank, you know, I would come up, but I'm afraid of being victimized and that type of thing. And when I look at the young people that accompanied us, I will say this to you, you know, we have a developing generation, Glyne, that does not carry the same apprehensions that we used to carry. They don't carry the same fears. I will tell you, they will kill you on the spot in the bat of an eyelid, while we may back away, you know, to be at peace and that. It's not the same generation. I am seeing that being manifested even as we look at what has happened with this gentleman we were speaking about a little while ago. You know, when we see what is happening within the communities in terms of people conflicting each other and so on, they're not afraid. It's almost like if I don't know if it's generation, whatever it is, Z or X or whatever they call themselves, the millenniums. But it is almost as if they feel they are Superman or Superwoman. There's not the same element of apprehension that we had. And when I say
I
we, I'm looking back. You know, I was taught. My mother taught me a significant aspect of respect and not fear. She taught me respect. But I
but
see in our current generation, when I look at people like Timon, and I listen, I just want to read this to you quickly before you make your comment, Glyne. This was Timon's statement. Um, and you will remember probably Maxine at the press conference. I have hope for this situation. Listen to this 20-year-old speaking. I have hope for the voice of the Barbadian people to rise up. It was once thought that Barbados was the perfect colony and that we would forever be on the bidding of England, never rebel. Then there was
yeah,
butter, he reflected.
there
They
you
thought
are.
they could infringe upon our rights as workers, and in the midst of our labor rights movement, there was Clement Paine. They thought even still that we would remain attached to them and still hold on to the Union Jack, but there was Barrow. So the same spirit that allowed the
Of
rebellion,
course.
our independence, and continued progression is still present today. It is not dead. And I will call upon the Barbadian people to embrace that spirit, that energy, drive, and force, which they like to say we don't have because we are a docile society. That's not
Uh,
who we are at the core, not who we are at credible point, not who we are at credible points in our history. That was Timon Howard
On Friday.
on Friday.
I think that substantiates my position. I really think of some of what I did not even remember that. But this is my observation
You
over
are
time.
correct.
But
Yeah, yeah.
let me but this fear of it just something just came to me. about victimization. Maybe I don't really talk about myself, but maybe you can tell how petty and pervasive this this fear of it, not this existence of petty victimization. Not it's not petty. It's fear of petty victimization or attempted. Like for example, as Maxine would know, as a former government minister, you will be invited to certain activities. Some weeks ago, when Minister Glyne died, I was home minding my business. My phone rang, and a young lady from the cab identified herself in the cab office, said if she's called to see if I was interested, if I would be interested in attending the funeral, the official funeral, Mr. Glyne. She didn't say I called to invite you. If you'd be interested, I said yeah, I would be. She said all right, you will get your invitation in the mail. A lot of things, Mark, seeing that they're not obtained in our standards now, in all they're obtained as the norm. And I said, fine, no, I left that. And then a few minutes later on, no, this is Tuesday, on the Wednesday, I got a call from another member of the cabinet office who wanted me to identify a photograph, the photograph of Prime Minister Owen Arthur's first cabinet outside the cabinet court, wanted me to identify people in it for them, to make sure it was a genuine photograph, including Mr. Glyne. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was it. But I hear nothing more from them.
So, yeah, if you're interested, but
if it be interested, but they call me back to verify. I get dropped from the team. That's it. That's not that matters to me, but it shows you how people could say it matters something to you. That's not matter me one really. Because I've been there, done that, seen that. So there's nothing embarrassing. I have to go to. I can't miss. Or would want. So it can be that petty, and therefore, when people say like that, no wonder that they themselves too have their own anxieties.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, when it comes to the invitations, and this is where you use the expression is not being as palpable as in the you're saying it is much more so now. This whole issue of fear, and this is and you have to ask yourself, why is this happening?
Yeah, how has this developed? Yeah,
and what it is that we have been seeing, and I am very clear about this. We have been, and it is translating itself or it's cascading across sectors and so on. There's a sense of bullying, of pressuring people, of dictating to people. So what you're seeing in school now is a behavior that mimics. Children are mimicking what they see the adults are doing.
Yes.
You know, I sat and Glyne can tell you about his experience. And I am only going on allegations. I sat in the cabinet for 10 years where there was due respect shown to the chairman, the prime minister, the two prime ministers with whom I worked. But we would have, very necessary robust discussions. Nobody ever used expletives to anybody. Nobody ever told anybody that they can't speak. And, and so there was respect that we were there as men and women. And people recognize, as it says, Prime Minister in the part, you had the Prime Minister's first among equals, and that respect was given. Now, in other situations, I've heard allegations of people being told not, or whatever, and I can hear of things I've heard around the region in other cabinets or whatever. But if you have a situation where a public officer in fact, let me use an example. Let me bring it back to Barbadian politics. I am amazed, and I was going to ask Glyne if he could check out for me if an instruction was ever given. But I would suggest to somebody go and do what I call a content analysis of speeches or statements made by members of cabinet since 2018 until now, and see the frequency with which reference is made to the Prime Minister and what the Prime Minister says or thinks or wants or whatever the case. It's almost as though I am speaking with the instructions. I'm speaking of instructions given to me. It is a strange thing. I don't know, Glyne, you would have been there before me. Now I'll come back to Nigel's comment there. But Glyne, because I just find it strange.
Do you want me to speak? Do you want me to help us come in now?
Yes,
on that point?
To help me understand.
Yeah. I also serve in the cabinet where the practice of Paris, primus inter pares, first of all, equals. It was not so much, and there were equals. Prime Minister Arthur treated everybody equally. As a matter of fact, I used to get great fun when people, some people tell me, you're only a minister of state, you're not a full minister. I said, don't mind that. I mean, I said all the ministers got the same money, whether you were
That's
a
true.
minister of or minister in. So
Not
there was not the
anymore.
only. I know that was the distinction. So I laughed at it. I said, "Well, I get the same." I remember someone saw that because there was one colleague who allowed themselves to be confused by people, and they were made a they became they were minister of state, and people were saying, "Man, see, Mr. Archer, minister of state," and they became very bitter, and they fell out Mr. Arthur, and they held him in his mind. He come out, he put out and said, he was from Mr. Arthur heard about it and asked about it. He said, "Are you vexed? You're, Mr. Prime Minister, I didn't get the same money as them, the same person." So a title does not make a difference. It's what you do with the job in the job, not the title you got. So that kind of fear and that kind of bully. Don't forget, um, we have seen the this question of the prime minister. The prime minister. Remember during the campaign, how 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 first of all, for all years I knew she was Mayor Motley. But once with the campaign, Mayor, I'm more Motley, please. Mayor, I'm more Motley. And I got it from good authority that candidates, people speaking at this platform were told they had to mention her name about 15 times also in a 20-minute speech. So that's what you heard is it is part of the almost cult of personality that's developed around her. And that is why some people do it instinctively. I I mean I used to talk about the government unless I direct. But in my speeches as a minister on my own right, I never used to make any references to the prime minister. It was my own man. It was the own minister, and he expected you to do that. So the prime minister never once gave me any instruction, even though I was a minister of state under him, responsible for several areas. I knew the policy. He said, "You know this policy. Go ahead and say it, talk." I never had a vet, and he never gave me instructions. So this idea of being obsequious and bowing, either like Mr. Strawn, to anybody, or calling in a reference because you have to bow to. And it nothing like to me. It does not. I can't work with it. It doesn't fit my personality, my brain, how I see life or whatever. So I really am sorry for them who think that they get validity and affirmation. They have to make reference to, although the prime minister is the source of all wisdom and everything and life. Remember Mr. Barr said, "The Lord giveth,
And the
the
Lord
Lord
taketh
take
away.
away.
Take away.
Blessed
Yeah.
be the name of the Lord."
You know,
But
as I was, sorry, as I was
no, you
growing
go
up,
ahead.
Maxine, as I was
Mm.
growing up, Maxine, Glyne,
Uh-huh.
um, my mother took me one day. She used to go over when we moved here to St. George, where we live now. You remember Mr. Adams used to live over in Walkers in
Right.
St. George. And quite often my mother would go over early on a Saturday morning to discuss matters of education with him. And so I went with her one morning, and I will tell you all the truth. I heard my mother carrying on the prime minister. He was the prime minister. I heard my mother carrying on the prime minister, and if I could have found a hole to go down into, I would have gone down into that hole. And when we left there coming back home, I turned to my mom and I said, "Mom, how you could talk to the prime minister like that?" You know, she was not disrespectful. She was extremely firm, extremely firm. And I turned and I asked her. She said, "Well, let me just let you know. Never forget, in spite of the fact that he's the prime minister, he's a man. Always remember that he's a man." And I learned that aspect in terms of allowing people to intimidate me. And also, I will say to you, Glyne Maxine, my faith in God, my faith in Christ has bolstered my boldness. Because there are two things I remember out of scripture. One says, I think in the book of Proverbs or Psalms, the fear of man setteth a snare. That's one says. And then the second one was Jesus himself, who talked about don't fear man who can only affect your body, but fear God who can destroy both body and soul in hell. And so I garnished a faith that will not allow a human individual, I don't care at what level you are at, to intimidate me, period. So this is why I talk about coming off the plantation, because I watched a video the other day on YouTube